This is Dominissimo Voxlor, delivering transmissions from the dark heart of the Imperium. In this broadcast, we turn our gaze to the savage heart of the galaxy, to the Orks, the green-skinned horde who have waged war across the stars since the dawn of time. Their story is one of brutality, conquest, and an unyielding will to fight. Sharpen your blade, ready your spirit, for in the heart of their war, only the strongest will survive. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the law of the Green Tide. The Orks, a race of green-skinned brutes who seem to revel in destruction, chaos and war. From the towering war bosses to the smallest Gretchen, they are driven by one thing and one thing only, the unrelenting urge to fight. But where did this race come from? What drives their constant cycle of violence? To understand the Orks, we must look far back, to a time when the galaxy was very different. The story of the Orks begins long before the rise of the Imperium of Man or the emergence of the great galactic powers as we know today. The origins of the Orks stretch back to the ancient forgotten days of the War in Heaven. This was a conflict of unimaginable scale, fought between two ancient races, the Old Ones, an enigmatic and technologically advanced species, and the Necrons, a race of metal immortals whose quest for immortality would lead them to horrific ends. The Old Ones, creators of many of the galaxy's most powerful species, were desperate to stave off the Necron threat. It was in this time of desperation that they sought to craft a race of soldiers who would be powerful enough to stand against the Necrons and their relentless might. This was the birth of the Krork, the ancestors of the Orks. The Krork were not a natural species, but a product of the Old Ones' technological genius. Engineered as a race of living weapons, the Krork were designed for one purpose: war. They were massive, towering warriors who could endure the harshest environments and thrive in battle. Their bodies were optimised for fighting, with dense muscle and sturdy frames, but their minds? Their minds were something else entirely. Unlike many other races, the Krork were not designed for complex thought or creativity. Instead, they were designed for one thing and one thing only: violence. They would fight, and in doing so, they would evolve. The more they fought, the stronger they became. The Old Ones programmed them with the ability to grow larger and far more powerful with each battle, a biological response designed to create an ever-evolving, unstoppable warrior class. The Krork were born as warriors, and they would live as warriors. However, despite all their strength and ferocity, the Krork lacked the necessary intelligence to truly be effective in combat. This is where the Old Ones introduced a twist. The Krork, like many other species they created, were fungal in nature. They were not fully biological, but instead were symbiotic with a parasitic organism. This organism would help drive the Krork's instincts, making them more capable of working together in battle. The fungal nature of the Krork made them resilient, able to survive wounds that would kill almost any other species. It also gave them the ability to rapidly reproduce through spores, spreading their warlike nature across the galaxy. The Krork were not perfect soldiers, however. They lacked a cohesive structure or leadership. They fought because it was in their nature, but they fought in a chaotic, uncoordinated manner. The Old Ones, in their desperation, began to introduce another element into the Krork's genetics: the ability to follow a leader. The Old Ones implanted the Krork with a subconscious drive to follow the strongest and most dominant among them. This would give rise to the war bosses, the towering leaders who would unite the Krork under their banners and lead them in brutal campaigns across the stars. The first true Ork was born from this transformation. The Orks would follow the strongest among them, and under the banner of their war boss they would become an unstoppable force. But the Krork's creation was not without its consequences. As the Old Ones' war against the Necrons reached its devastating conclusion, the Krork were left to their own devices. Their creators, the Old Ones, were eventually wiped out in the aftermath of the War in Heaven, leaving the Krork to roam the galaxy unchallenged. With no enemies to fight, the Krork began to turn on each other. The war that the Old Ones had designed them for was gone, and they found themselves in a new, brutal world where only the strongest would survive. In the following millennia, the Krork's evolution began to take strange turns. Through the Ork spores, new generations were born. The Orks that emerged were smaller than the original Krork, but they were still fierce warriors with an insatiable thirst for battle. Over time, the Orks began to spread across the galaxy. They became a fixture of the cosmos, laying waste to everything in their path. They established their own hierarchies, with war bands and tribes led by mighty war bosses, but they remained as savage and chaotic as their original form. Ork society as it stands today is a reflection of their ancient origins. It is a society born of violence and driven by instinct, with no higher purpose than to fight. There is no concept of peace, no grand design beyond the next battle. Every Ork, from the lowliest Gretchen to the mightiest war boss, is driven by the same desire: to kill, to fight, and to win. They have no concept of diplomacy, no interest in anything other than the next great Waaagh. The Orks are a fascinating paradox. On one hand, they are a savage, barbaric race obsessed with war and destruction. On the other, they are a testament to the ingenuity of the Old Ones, who created them to be living weapons. Over the millennia, the Orks have become an unstoppable force, capable of bringing entire worlds to their knees. Their Waaagh energy, a collective psychic force that binds them together, makes them even more dangerous. This psychic energy allows the Orks to defy the laws of physics and reality, making their crude technology work in ways that would baffle even the most advanced minds of the galaxy. It is through this Waaagh energy that Ork vehicles, weapons, and even armour work, despite being made of scrap and salvage parts. The Orks don't care about the science behind it, they just know that it works because they believe it works. The Orks' creation was not a simple accident. They were designed for war, and in war, they thrive. The Orks are a race that embodies the primal instinct to fight, to conquer, and to survive. They have no greater ambition than the next step, the next fight, the next battle. And though they are often seen as nothing more than a plague of green-skinned savages, they are, in many ways, a mirror of the galaxy itself. A place where survival is a constant struggle, where war is eternal, and where the strong rule. Whether they are Orks or any of the other countless species vying for power in the cosmos. As the Orks spread across the galaxy, their primitive beginnings have been forgotten by most. What remains is a race that lives for battle, a species whose identity is rooted in the chaos of the battlefield. From the smallest Gretchen to the mightiest war boss, every Ork is driven by the same need: to fight. And this is the story of the Orks, a tale of creation, destruction, and eternal war. A race born for war, forged for battle, and destined to continue the cycle until the very end of time. Long after the fall of the ancient Old Ones, as the galaxy drifted into chaos and darkness, the Orks began to make their mark across the stars in a new, more chaotic age, the Age of Strife. It was a time when humanity was just beginning to explore the stars, and the galaxy was teeming with strange, powerful, and sometimes hostile alien civilizations. The Orks, however, had been here long before humanity, and their story was one of endless war, unrelenting in its ferocity and relentless in its scope. The Age of Strife was marked by an era of unprecedented instability. The Imperium of Man had yet to emerge from the depths of the Dark Age of technology, and humanity's expansion into the galaxy was hindered by warp storms, isolation, and fractured communications. In this chaotic environment, the Orks began to spread across the galaxy in search of new challenges, new enemies, and new territories to conquer. But unlike the emergent human race, whose leaders and empires were often driven by the desire for knowledge or survival, the Orks had only one desire: war. It was during this age that the Orks began to thrive, spreading across countless worlds and establishing their own empires. Their warbands, guided by the brutal strength of their war bosses, rampaged through the systems, overwhelming small human colonies, independent Xenos civilizations, and even older races who had managed to survive the long centuries since the War in Heaven. These early encounters with the Orks would come to shape humanity's understanding of the Greenskin menace, one that would not be fully appreciated until the later millennia. One of the earliest known encounters between humanity and the Orks occurred in the Sol system, on the isolated human world of Istavan, a colony founded during the Golden Age of technology. The Ork invasion came without warning, as Ork warbands led by a particularly powerful war boss descended on the planet. For years, the colony had been isolated from the rest of humanity due to the instability of warp travel, and by the time word had reached the rest of the Imperium, it was already too late. The Ork warbands had overwhelmed the defenders, and the human population was either slaughtered or enslaved. The invasion of Istavan was a harbinger of what was to come. Though humanity's forces were eventually able to drive the Orks off-world, the green tide of Ork warriors was a growing threat across the galaxy. Throughout the Age of Strife, there were countless other incidents in which the Orks would invade, conquer, and raise human colonies. The Orks had no need for grand strategies or complicated political agendas. They simply fought because that was what they were made to do. They revelled in the chaos, in the destruction, and in the violence, and it was this insatiable hunger for battle that made them so dangerous. Ork warbands would often settle in the ruins of old cities, claiming them as their own and using whatever scraps and remnants they could find to build their new weapons, vehicles, and fortifications. The Orks were able to harness their bizarre, barely functional technology's deadly effect, using looted and repurposed weapons to fight against any foe that crossed their path. It was in this environment of scavenging and war that the Orks began to spread across the galaxy, creating a patchwork of empires, each ruled by its own dominant war boss. These war bosses, many of whom had no clear loyalty to one another, were constantly vying for supremacy and control over their warbands, but it mattered little. As long as there was an enemy to fight, the Orks would always find a way to unite under the banner of war. While the Orks were becoming a more familiar presence in the galaxy, humanity itself was also beginning to make strides. The Dark Age of technology was slowly drawing to a close, and humanity was on the cusp of greatness. However, their emerging greatness would not be without its challenges. During this time, the Emperor of Mankind, the leader of the nascent human Imperium, began its campaign of unification across Terra and beyond. The Emperor sought to unite humanity's fractured worlds, hoping to forge a great empire that would bring stability and order to the galaxy. But as humanity expanded, it inevitably crossed paths with the Orks. The first major encounter between the Emperor's forces and the Orks during the Great Crusade came on the world of Goro, a planet ruled by a brutal Ork warband. The Orks had settled Goro after driving off or enslaving the native population, and they had established a stronghold in the planet's cities. When the Emperor's forces arrived to put down the Ork threat, they were met with fierce resistance. The Orks, led by a warlord who had conquered the world through sheer force, fought with all the savagery that was their nature, but the Emperor's forces, composed of the Lunar Wolves Legion, the Emperor's favoured Space Marine chapter, were not easily deterred. In a series of brutal skirmishes, the Lunar Wolves fought their way across Goro, pushing the Orks back with their superior tactics and advanced weaponry. Despite their crude and sometimes unreliable technology, the Orks were able to inflict significant casualties on the Lunar Wolves. But their victory was not to last. The Lunar Wolves, commanded by Horus, the Emperor's most trusted son, eventually overwhelmed the Ork warlord and laid waste to the Ork forces. With the fall of Goro, the Emperor's forces had moved on to their next target, but they knew this was only the beginning of a much larger war. It was during this period that the Emperor realised the true scope of the Ork threat. Unlike other xeno-species that could be reasoned with, the Orks seemed to thrive on conflict itself. They did not seek to conquer in the traditional sense, but to fight and destroy. The Emperor knew that if the Orks were allowed to continue their unchecked expansion, they would be a never-ending threat to the Imperium. The decision was made: the Orks must be eradicated. This led to one of the most famous campaigns of the Great Crusade, the Ulanor Crusade. The Ulanor system, located in the Segmentum Solar, was the home to one of the largest and most powerful Ork empires in the galaxy. The Ork warlord, Urlach-Urg, had united countless Ork tribes under his banner, creating an empire that spanned entire sectors. His Waaagh was a terrifying force, and it seemed that no one could stand in its way. The Orks of Ulanor were well equipped, having scavenged technology from countless worlds, and their war machines were formidable. The Emperor could not allow this power to go unchecked. The Imperium had to strike, and strike fast, before the Orks could gain even more strength. The Emperor assembled a vast army composed of tens of thousands of soldiers from the Imperial Army and hundreds of Space Marine chapters, and prepared for the campaign that would determine the fate of the Ulanor system. This was to be a war unlike any the galaxy had seen before. The battle for Ulanor was a monumental undertaking, and the Emperor's forces knew that they were facing an enemy unlike any other. The Orks, led by the mighty Urlach-Urg, had assembled an army of unimaginable size. The initial clash was brutal. Ork warbands, numbering in the millions, descended upon the Imperial lines with a fury that only the Orks could muster. The battle raged across the surface of Ulanor, with Ork war machines and the Space Marine Titans smashing into one another in a storm of fire and destruction. But despite the ferocity of the Ork assault, the Imperium's forces held firm. The Lunar Wolves Legion, under the leadership of Horus, led the charge against the Ork forces. Horus, the Emperor's most trusted son, was a master tactician and a brilliant leader. His strategies were able to outmaneuver the Ork hordes, and his forces pressed forward relentlessly, determined to crush the Ork threat once and for all. The battle was long and hard fought, but the Imperium's superior tactics and technology eventually began to turn the tide. As the battle raged on, the Emperor himself took the field, leading his forces into the heart of the Ork Empire. It was here the true scope of the Ork menace became apparent. The Orks were not just a mindless horde, they were a race capable of building their own war machines, capable of adapting to their environment, and capable of waging war on a galactic scale. The Emperor's forces were pushed to their limits as they faced wave after wave of Ork warriors, each one more determined than the last. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Emperor's forces never faltered. The final blow came when Horus, leading a detachment of Space Marines, broke through the Ork defences and reached the heart of Urlach-Urg's stronghold. In a climactic battle, Horus engaged Urlach-Urg in single combat. The Orc warlord was a massive and terrifying figure, but Horus was a force of nature himself. The two warriors clashed in a battle that shook the very foundations of Ullanor. Ultimately, Horus struck down Urlach-org, ending the Orc threat to the Ullanor system once and for all. The Imperium had triumphed. The Ullanor Crusade was a decisive victory for the Emperor, and it marked a turning point in the war against the Orcs. With the death of Urlach-org, the Orc Empire began to fragment, and the Orcs of Ullanor were scattered. The Imperium had broken the back of the Orc Empire, but had not eradicated the Orc threat. The Orcs, as always, were not so easily defeated. Even in defeat they proved to be an unstoppable force, and their horde would return again and again. In the aftermath of the battle, the Emperor celebrated the victory by giving a great triumph in the halls of the Imperial Palace. But the victory was bittersweet. The Orcs had been broken for now, but the Emperor knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The Orcs would return, and when they did, the Imperium would face them once more. The Ullanor Crusade was a shining moment in the history of the Great Crusade, a testament to the might of the Emperor and his Space Marines, but it was also a reminder of the danger that the Orcs posed to the Imperium. The Orcs were not a race that could be easily vanquished. They were a force of nature, a species driven by a single purpose: to fight, to destroy, and to conquer. And in the far reaches of the galaxy, their Waaagh continued to grow, ready to unleash itself upon the Imperium once again. The Orcs' constant cycle of warfare, their unrelenting desire to conquer and destroy, would be a challenge for the Imperium for millennia to come. The Emperor and his legions would continue their crusade, spreading humanity's light across the stars, but the Orcs would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next great battle. The Green Tide, it seemed, was destined to never truly be defeated. Long after the Great Crusade had been forged and the Emperor had moved into the shadows of the Imperium of Man, the galaxy settled into a grim period known as the Age of the Imperium. But the Orcs, far from vanquished, were about to present an even greater challenge than before. While the Emperor and his Imperium were focused on expanding, consolidating, and holding the Imperium's dominion, the galaxy's unceasing chaos was not so easily held in check. Far away from the sight of the Emperor, deep in the heart of Orc space, a massive Waaagh was building, one that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy, the Waaagh of the Beast. By the 32nd millennium, the Orc threat was seen as a mere nuisance, something that could be handled through suppression and containment. The Orcs had always been a fractured, splintered race, warband after warband, each vying for dominance. Even though the Orcs had their formidable leaders such as the mighty Ghazghkull Thraka, most of their victories were won through sheer force, not through any deep unified strategy, and so the Imperium during this period had largely learned to deal with the Orcs as isolated, scattered hordes that were quickly put down with sufficient firepower. However, deep in the Octarius sector, a powerful new force was emerging. It would bring with it the first truly coordinated Orc empire since the time of the Ullanor Crusade. This force, known only as the Beast, was destined to forever alter the course of Orc history. His rise would demonstrate a terrifying new power, the ability to unite the desperate, fractious Orc warbands under one single banner, an unrelenting tide that threatened to sweep across the Imperium like a storm. The rise of the Beast began on a desolate, almost forgotten world called Arran Prime. Arran Prime was little more than a mineral-rich planet, hosting only a few scattered Imperial settlements. It was a type of world that the Imperium usually ignored, far from the central systems and deemed insignificant. However, to the Orcs it was a perfect place to breed and grow, untouched and waiting for a strong enough war boss to seize it. This is where the Beast first appeared. Unlike other Orc leaders whose power was based on brute strength alone, the Beast had an uncanny ability to bring Orc warbands together, to rally them, to inspire them to fight with one purpose. The Orcs of the Octarius system, who had spent centuries fighting among themselves, found in the Beast a leader who offered them a new way to see battle. The Beast was a force of nature, the embodiment of every Orc's desire for war, but with one critical difference. He understood the power of unity. It was this newfound unity that made him so dangerous. Under the leadership of the Beast, Orc forces began to unite under one banner, and soon a massive Waaagh was born. This Waaagh was unlike any the galaxy had seen before. The Beast was not a mere warlord, he was a charismatic leader, one who could shape the Orc mind and inspire loyalty in ways previously unheard of. His strength was undeniable, but it was his ability to bring together the various Orc factions that truly set him apart. Goths, Evil Suns, Bad Moons, Death Skulls, and even Blood Axes all fell in line behind him, forming an unstoppable horde. His power was intoxicating. His Orcs surged forward with a newfound ferocity, not just fighting to survive, but fighting for the glory of the Waaagh itself. The Beast's Waaagh was unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. The planet of Aaron Prime was the first to fall, but it would not be the last. The Ork invasion spread like wildfire, laying waste to everything it touched. Imperial worlds were overrun, and the Imperium's best defences crumbled under the sheer weight of Ork numbers. The Beast was a warlord of incredible power, able to lead his forces with ruthless efficiency, even turning Ork technology into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. He harnessed the Waaagh energy, an intangible force that drove Ork technology to work in ways no one could explain. Crude, salvaged weapons and makeshift vehicles became incredibly effective, breaking Imperial lines and overwhelming well-trained human forces. What made the Waaagh of the Beast truly terrifying was it did not merely stop with one system. It spread from world to world like a plague, as though the very spirit of war had awoken in the Ork race. For the first time in centuries, Orks no longer fought simply for plunder and territory, they fought for something more. A unified war with the goal of total conquest. The Beast's influence spread across the Ork race. No longer content to brawl among themselves, the Orks fought with a singular purpose under his leadership. They believed that victory was inevitable, and that they were destined to overwhelm the galaxy in one final glorious war. The Imperium, initially slow to react, soon realised the magnitude of the threat they faced. The Imperium's leadership underestimated the Beast at first, dismissing his rise as another fleeting Ork uprising. But they could not have been more wrong. The Beast's Waaagh began to move through Imperial systems with terrifying speed. Where once the Imperium had dealt with Ork raids, now they faced a galactic war, a war that would push the Imperium to its limits. The Beast's army was relentless, with Ork warbands crushing everything in their path. The sheer force of the Waaagh tore through the defences of entire Imperial systems, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The Imperial military, stretched thin across the galaxy, struggled to mount an effective counterattack. Even the Adeptus Astartes, the mighty Space Marines, were caught off guard by the scale of the assault. The Beast's forces were more organised than any Ork warband had been before. He commanded his army with an unyielding precision, sending wave after wave of Ork forces into battle, each one more deadly than the last. The Imperial Navy mobilised to stop the Ork invasion, and the forces of the Imperial Guard scrambled to defend their worlds. But the Ork threat was more now organised than ever. The Beast had unified the Orks in a way that had never been done before, and they fought not just with ferocity, but with determination. Every Ork warrior, from the lowliest Gretchen to the mightiest war boss, was motivated by a singular belief, that the Beast was their prophet, their leader. Sent by Gork and Mork themselves to bring about the end of the galaxy's enemies. The Orks were unstoppable in their fervour, pushing the Imperium back at every turn. As the Waaagh of the Beast swept across the galaxy, the Ork horde began to take on a terrifying form. The Imperium, unable to stem the tide, realised that the threat was existential. The Beast's Waaagh threatened not just individual worlds but the entire Imperium. The war that the Orks now waged was no longer just about territory, it was about the destruction of the Imperium itself. Desperation set in among the Imperium's leadership. A series of strategic counter-offensives were launched, but each time they were met with failure. The Ork horde was relentless, outnumbering the Imperium's forces by an unimaginable degree. The Beast's influence had spread so far that even those Orks who once fought independently or even rebelled against his rule now joined the Waaagh in droves. The galaxy had become the stage for an unprecedented battle, one in which the very survival of humanity was at stake. The Imperium finally began to recognise the need for an ultimate solution. The Beast's rise had brought a new kind of chaos to the galaxy, one the Imperium could not contain with conventional methods. The time had come for the Imperium to face its most formidable foe in a battle for survival. But the question remained, could humanity overcome a force that had now become the embodiment of universal war itself? For the Orks, however, the Beast's Waaagh was not about victory in the traditional sense. The Orks were never concerned with the outcome in the way other civilizations were. To them, the fight was everything. The Beast, as their figurehead, was the embodiment of their greatest desire, not the conquest of a single world, but the eternal war that defined their existence. This was a struggle for domination, but also for the pure joy of battle. The Orks were fighting because it was who they were, not because they sought anything else. The Beast's rise was merely a reflection of their ceaseless hunger for conflict. In the end, the Waaagh of the Beast was halted, but not before it had already taken an unimaginable toll on the Imperium. It would be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the Imperium's history, a reminder that the Orks, when united under a powerful leader, were capable of challenges that could shake the very foundations of the galaxy. The Beast's Waaagh was an era of ruin, devastation and battle, an age in which the Orks were as much a force of nature as they were a civilization. For the Imperium, the Beast's rise was a warning. No matter how far humanity advanced, the Orks would always be waiting, ready to plunge the galaxy back into war. And as long as the Orks thrived, they would forever stand as a testament to the chaos that could never be eradicated. Orc society is unlike any other in the galaxy, a strange paradox of brutality and chaos interwoven with a highly effective, albeit crude, structure. The Orcs are a race defined not by the usual cultural markers of wisdom, diplomacy or refinement, but by one simple rule: might makes right. All of Orc society revolves entirely around strength, violence, and the endless quest for war. This is their world, one of conquest, unrelenting conflict, a place where the weak are crushed underfoot, and only the strongest, most brutal leaders rise to the top. And yet, despite the raw, primal nature of their existence, the Orcs have an undeniably effective way of organising their chaotic warbands and tribes, a structure that has allowed them to thrive and become one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. Orc society is first and foremost driven by the instinct to fight. Whether they are battling each other for dominance or waging war against other species, every Orc lives for the thrill of combat. They have no concept for peace or diplomacy, no interest in building empires or forming lasting alliances in the traditional sense. Their sole purpose is to wage war, and in war they find meaning, joy and purpose. Every Orc boy, Gretchen, Nobs, Weird Boy and War Boss knows this truth. War is life, and life is war. At the heart of Orc society are the War Bosses, the brutal leaders who command their warbands and hold their tribes together through sheer force of personality and strength. The War Boss is a terrifying figure, a larger-than-life Orc whose physical might and reputation are unmatched. It is through his dominance that a tribe or warband functions. The War Boss is not just a leader, he is the embodiment of the Orc way of life, a symbol of power and strength, and a figure who inspires loyalty through fear and admiration. But while War Bosses may rule through power, their leadership is never absolute. Orc society is fundamentally anarchic, and War Bosses must constantly prove their strength or risk being challenged. The rise of an Orc War Boss is often marked by a violent combat, with challengers stepping forward to take on the current leader in brutal duels. If the challenger wins, they become the new War Boss, and the cycle continues. The Orcs' need for constant combat extends even to leadership, and a War Boss must always be prepared to defend their position against those who challenge them. Below the War Boss are Nobs, the brutal warriors who serve as the War Boss's right-hand Orcs. These fierce and battle-hardened Orcs are typically larger and stronger than the regular boys, and they are the ones who enforce the War Boss's rule and lead the Orc forces into battle. Nobs are typically the most experienced and skilled fighters in a warband, and their role is to keep the rank-and-file Orcs in line and ensure the warband runs efficiently. Though Nobs are unquestionably loyal to their War Boss, they too may rise to challenge their leader if they believe they are strong enough to take control. Such a challenge can spark a deadly power struggle within a warband, as the Nobs fight amongst themselves for dominance. The majority of Orc society consists of the Boys, the rank-and-file warriors who make up the bulk of an Orc army. These Orcs are often seen as little more than cannon fodder, the grunts who are thrown into battle to die for their War Bosses. But while they may appear to be expendable, they are far from helpless. Boys are tough, strong, and incredibly resilient, capable of surviving environments where other species would perish. They fight for one reason and one reason alone: to win, to kill, and to prove their strength. The Orcs are a race that prizes aggression above all else, and the Boys are the ones who can bring that aggression to life in the form of endless battle and brutal assaults. Orc warbands are fluid and ever-changing, held together not by loyalty or ideology, but by singular desire to fight. The Boys may follow a War Boss for a time, but if they believe a new leader is stronger or more capable, they will readily abandon their current leader and flock to the new one. This lack of permanent allegiance makes Orc society constantly in flux, and alliances are often short-lived. The Orcs are more interested in the thrill of battle than in the stability of their leadership, and they follow whoever offers them the best opportunity to kill and loot. One of the most fascinating aspects of Orc society is their clans, which are cultural factions that define an Orc style of fighting and approach to war. There are several major clans within Orc society, each with its own distinct characteristics and fighting methods. The major clans include the Goths, the Evil Suns, the Bad Moons, the Death Skulls, and the Snakebites, among others. Each clan has its own traditions, colours, and preferred methods of warfare, and Orcs take great pride in their clan affiliations. The Goths are the most brutal and straightforward of all the clans. They are known for their love of close-quarter combat and their obsession with hand-to-hand fighting. The Goths are the classic Orc warriors, charging into battle with axes, swords, and clubs, eager to rip the enemies apart with their bare hands. Their warbands are highly disciplined in their ferocity, with an emphasis on direct, overwhelming force. The Goths believe in smashing through enemy lines with sheer power and strength, and their motto is simple: kill 'em all. The Evil Suns are the speed freaks of Orc society. They love nothing more than fast vehicles and high-speed chases, and they have an obsession with making their machines go faster. The evil sons paint all their vehicles red, because, as every orc knows, red ones go faster. These orcs are typically armed with massive guns and powerful vehicles, and they have a talent for hit and run tactics, striking fast and hard before disappearing back into the landscape. The evil sons are always on the move, always seeking the next adrenaline rush, and their view of war is not as a grind, but as a race to see who can get to battle first. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest and most ostentatious of the orc clans. They are known for their obsession with loot and wealth, and they are quick to take advantage of any opportunity to gather riches. The Bad Moons are often seen as greedy and self-serving, hoarding all the teeth, or currency, they can find. They favour flashy, heavily armed war machines and weapons, and they often have the most advanced technology of any orc clan, though it is often scavenged or looted from other races. The Bad Moons are also infamous for their wealth-based hierarchy. The richest orcs are the most powerful, and their immense fortunes allow them to command greater resources and more powerful weaponry. The Ghazghkulls are the scavengers and loot-obsessed orcs who live for the thrill of finding and collecting the best gear. They are renowned for their ability to scavenge technology from all corners of the galaxy, and their warbands are often equipped with bizarre, cobbled-together weapons and vehicles. The Ghazghkulls are less concerned with conventional tactics and more interested in acquiring new technology and equipment. They have a reputation for being sneaky and opportunistic, striking when their enemies least expect it and raiding weak points to steal anything of value. Their motto is "Finders Keepers," and they live by this creed. The Snakebites are the more primitive and feral clan, rejecting the technology and fast-paced lifestyle of the more advanced orc factions. Instead, the Snakebites live off the land, hunting giant beasts and using crude weapons like knives, axes and spears. They are fiercely independent and proud of their traditional ways, and they view other orc clans with suspicion. The Snakebites are known for their wild, untamed nature, and they are often seen riding giant squigs or other monstrous beasts into battle. To them, the thrill of the hunt is just as important as the fight itself. Though these clans are often at odds with one another, orc society is not as fragmented as it seems. Despite their chaotic, fractious nature, the orcs are united by one common trait, the Waaagh. This powerful psychic force binds the orcs together, filling them with a shared lust for violence and destruction. It is the Waaagh that drives the orcs to fight, conquer and destroy, and it's the Waaagh that ensures the orcs will never truly be defeated. Even when their clans war against one another, the Waaagh ensures that they are never far from the common cause, war. Orc society is one of violence, but also one of unity and chaos. It is a world where strength and power determine who leads, who survives and who dies. The orcs live for battle, and they die by it as well. Their culture is one of constant struggle, a world where the next scrap, the next fight, is always just around the corner. And as long as there is an orc left to fight, there will always be another battle, another war, and another chance for the greenskins to prove that they are, indeed, the strongest force in the galaxy. Orc religion, if it can even be called that, is a far cry from the organised, structured faiths of other species. The orcs do not worship gods in the conventional sense, nor do they follow any moral code or principles beyond that of their own survival and dominance. Yet, despite this seemingly crude approach to spirituality, the orcs possess a strange, almost chaotic belief system, centred around the worship of two powerful gods, Gork and Mork. In the orc pantheon, the two gods are not defined by grand philosophers or moral imperatives, but by raw, brutal force. They are the ultimate expressions of the orc psyche, violence, cunning, and the sheer joy of combat. These two gods, often portrayed as towering godlike figures, are as much part of orc culture as the weapons they wield or the wars they fight. Gork and Mork are not gods of peace or wisdom, but of warfare, strength and destruction. They embody the very nature of orc existence. Gork is known as the god of brutal cunning. He is the orc god of direct violence and raw strength. To the orcs, Gork represents the ultimate force of power, the one who will smash through everything in his way without hesitation or mercy. Gork's followers believe that the best way to defeat an enemy is simply to crush them with an overwhelming might. There is no subtlety, no strategy, just the relentless application of power. When an orc feels the urge to charge into battle with his fists or swing his massive weapon, it is Gork's influence that drives him. The more brutal and savage the assault, the closer the orc becomes to Gork's ideal of combat. Orcs who favour smashing their enemies in close combat, throwing themselves into the fray without care for tactics, are often the true children of Gork. Mork, on the other hand, represents the god of cunning brutality. While Gork is all about direct explosive force, Mork is the more devious of the two gods. Mork's followers are those orcs who prefer a little more trickery and subtlety in their violence. The cunning, deceptive side of the orc mindset, Mork is the god of ambushes, surprise attacks, and tactical deception. To the orcs, Mork is the one who teaches them that a quick, brutal strike from an unexpected direction is just as effective as sheer force. Mork's believers are often the ones who are more likely to employ sneaky tactics, such as camouflage, setting traps, or waiting for the right moment to strike. They prefer not to engage in direct combat if they can help it, instead using their cunning to outwit their enemies and deliver a crushing blow when it's least expected. But here's the thing. To an orc, the line between Ghazghkull and Mork is as blurry as the difference between bashing someone's skull in with a club or sneaking up behind them and shooting them in the back. The orcs often argue and debate about which god is the most powerful, but in the end it hardly matters. The orcs' belief in their gods is not so much about worship in the traditional sense, but about a shared understanding of what it means to be an orc, to fight, to destroy, and to revel in the sheer joy of combat, whether they favour Gork's brutal, unrelenting approach or Mork's clever, savage strategies. Every orc believes in both gods. Because ultimately, the orc way of life is about war, and these gods embody that warlike existence. For the orcs, belief in Ghazghkull and Mork is not based on the usual rituals or prayers. It is something far more primal. Their faith is forged in the heat of battle, in the rush of combat, in the moment when the fighting gets intense or their instincts kick in. The orcs do not need priests or temples to commune with their gods. Instead, they believe that their gods are with them at all times, guiding their actions in the thick of war. They believe that the Waaagh energy that flows through their collective psyche presence is the very will of Ghazghkull and Mork themselves, a force that imbues every orc with a thirst of destruction and unrelenting drive to conquer. This Waaagh energy is the lifeblood of the orc race, and it fuels their ability to fight, to rebuild, and to even make their crude technology work. Orc weird boys, the orcs' most powerful and unstable psykers, are believed to be the conduits for this Waaagh energy, acting as channels through which Ghazghkull and Mork's power is transmitted to the orcs around them. When a weird boy is surrounded by a massive number of orcs, the Waaagh energy amplifies, and his psychic abilities reach unimaginable levels. The more orcs there are, the stronger the psychic power, and it is this surge of energy that the orcs' most bizarre and dangerous technology comes to life. The orcs do not understand the science behind it, but they believe that Ghazghkull and Mork make it work, whether it's their crude clunky guns, their ramshackle vehicles, or their towering war machines. Orc technology functions simply because the orcs believe it will. The weird boys in particular are revered as spiritual leaders within orc society, though not in the same way as priests or shamans might be seen in other cultures. A weird boy's power is as much a result of his raw psychic ability as it is his status within the orc horde. They can channel the Waaagh energy into devastating psychic blasts, causing explosions of green energy to tear through their enemies. Yet, their power is widely unpredictable. At any moment, the weird boy may explode under the immense strain of the Waaagh energy, causing massive destruction to friend and foe alike. The weird boys are the most dangerous and volatile members of orc society, yet they are essential to the war effort, serving as the living conduits through which Ghazghkull and Mork's divine influence flows. Despite their chaotic, unpredictable nature, the orcs are incredibly superstitious. They believe that their gods, Ghazghkull and Mork, are constantly watching over them, guiding them toward ever greater battles. They believe that every victory in battle is a sign that Ghazghkull and Mork are pleased with them, and that every defeat is simply an opportunity to try again. Even when their warbands are scattered or their leaders fall, the orcs believe that the gods are testing them, making them stronger, and pushing them towards greater challenges. For the orcs, there is no end to the war, no victory too great, and no defeat too final. Their gods demand continuity. The war must go on. The Waaagh must continue, and the orc race must keep fighting, forever. In the end, it is this singular, brutal belief system that fuels the orcs' endless cycle for war and destruction. For the orcs, everything they do, every battle, every fight, every victory and defeat, is in the name of Ghazghkull and Mork, the gods of brutal cunning and cunning brutality. These gods drive the orcs forward, pushing them into the next battle, the next scrap, the next Waaagh, in a never-ending quest for victory, glory, and above all, destruction. As long as there is an orc left in the galaxy, Ghazghkull and Mork will be there, guiding them towards the next war, the next great victory, and the next fight. By the 41st millennium, the Imperium of Man was reeling under the weight of multiple threats to its survival: the encroaching Chaos forces, the ever-looming shadow of the Tyranids, and the constant raiding of orc warbands scattered across the galaxy. However, among the countless dangers the Imperium faced, none was far more formidable than the return of a figure from orc lore who would shake the very foundations of mankind's empire: Ghazghkull Thraka. Ghazghkull, the self-proclaimed prophet of the Waaagh, was a war boss of legend, feared and revered by orcs across the galaxy. His rise to prominence was not the work of brute strength alone, but a mix of visionary leadership and ruthless pragmatism. He was not simply a strong orc who could command the loyalty of his warband through sheer force. Ghazghkull was a figure who understood the deeper currents of orc society, a being who claimed to have received visions from Ghork and Mork themselves. His rise would usher a new age of orc conquest, one that would bring the galaxy to its knees. In the beginning, Ghazghkull's journey was not destined for greatness. He was born a humble boy, much like any other orc. But it was on the war-torn world of Armageddon where his fortunes would change forever. Armageddon was a strategically vital industrial world for the Imperium, a place of immense value due to its role in the creation of vast war machines. It was also a world that had been a thorn in the side of orc kind for centuries. While orc warbands had raided the planet before, none had succeeded in conquering it. But Ghazghkull was different. He was more than just a war boss. He was a charismatic leader who knew how to unite the desperate orc tribes. He rallied orc forces from across the galaxy, fusing warbands and promising something greater than just loot and victory. He promised them a Waaagh that would be guided by the very will of Ghork and Mork, an apocalyptic campaign to burn the galaxy in orc fire. And so, under his command, the orcs began to unite in unprecedented numbers, swelling into a force unlike the galaxy had seen in a millennia. The orc invasion of Armageddon in the 941st year in the 41st millennium marked the beginning of the Second War of Armageddon, one of the most brutal and apocalyptic conflicts in human history. Ghazghkull's Waaagh was just not an orc raid, it was an invasion of a scale so vast and so overwhelming that even the might of the Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Astartes could scarcely hold the line. The orcs, once disjointed and fragmented, now surged together under Ghazghkull's banner as a unified force. This was the first true orc threat to humanity's survival in the modern era, and the Imperium was unprepared for it. In the opening days of the conflict, the orc horde smashed through the Imperium defences with relentless speed. The planet's defences were overwhelmed by the sheer force of the orc assault, and the orcs quickly overran key positions across Armageddon's second and third moons. Entire Imperial formations were decimated in surprise attacks, and the planetary defence systems were thrown into chaos. The Imperial Guard and the Space Marines stationed on Armageddon, most notably the Imperial Fists and Salamanders, were quickly drawn into the fighting force as the orcs tore through urban centres and military installations, looting everything in sight and bringing everything they encountered to ruin. In the chaos of battle, Ghazghkull's legend began to grow. He was not only a war boss but a figure who claimed divine favour. Ghazghkull asserted that he had been chosen by the orc gods, Ghork and Mork, to lead a new era of orc supremacy. He preached that the Waaagh was no longer just about fighting for loot or territory, but about fulfilling the will of the gods. This mystical aspect of Ghazghkull's leadership was what set him apart from every other orc war boss. He had the power to inspire his warriors, not just through fear, but through belief. Ghazghkull's proclamation that he was the prophet of Ghork and Mork gave him an aura of invincibility in the eyes of his followers, elevating him to something greater than just a leader. To his orc followers, Ghazghkull was a living god, the herald of an unstoppable war that would crush all before it. But despite the orc victory in early stages, the Imperium was not so easily defeated. The planet's Adeptus Mechanicus and Imperial Guard commanders quickly organised a counter-offensive, determined to halt Ghazghkull's advance before he could establish a foothold that would become impossible to dislodge. But the orc war machine was vast. Ghazghkull's Waaagh was not just a mob of uncoordinated raiders, but an organised, sprawling horde full of mech boys who had scavenged the most advanced weaponry from every corner of the galaxy, from salvaged Titan-class war machines to looted weapons from the Imperium itself. As the war dragged on, Ghazghkull's tactics became more sophisticated. He used psychological warfare, launching night raids and ambushes to terrorise the human defenders. The gargantuan orc war machines, the Gargants, towering walking war machines, looted and rebuilt by the orcs, ploughed through the human defences, while hordes of orc boys overran human positions. Ghazghkull used flying rocks, massive orc spacecraft filled with soldiers, to hit key locations across Armageddon. These strikes were coordinated, precise and relentless, wearing down the Imperial defenders day after day. Despite their fierce resistance from the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines, the orc forces had the initiative. At the pivotal siege of Hades' Hive, the orc war boss, along with his generals, surrounded the largest and most well-defended Imperial city on Armageddon. The battle was brutal, with orcs and humans clashing in the streets, in the ruins and above in the skies. The battle raged for weeks, with neither side giving ground. Ghazghkull's charisma as a leader fueled his warriors, keeping the orc forces fighting with tireless aggression. But the Imperium was not without its champions. Commissar Sebastian Yarick, a legendary figure in the Imperium defence, played a key role in the defence of Armageddon. Yarick's leadership on the front line was unmatched, and his unbreakable will became a symbol of hope for the beleaguered defenders. Yarrick was a true hero of the Imperium, inspiring his forces with an unwavering resolve. Even as his own troops were slaughtered around him, Yarrick held his ground, refusing to allow Armageddon to fall into the hands of the Orks. It was during this battle that the two legendary figures, Ghazghkull and Yarrick, would clash. The story of their battle became the stuff of legends in both Ork and Imperial history. Yarrick, wielding his famous power claw, faced down Ghazghkull in a personal duel. In the end, while the fight was intense, Yarrick was unable to defeat the Ork warlord. Ghazghkull proved himself more powerful of the two, but Yarrick's resilience and refusal to die became a symbol of humanity's resolve. Despite the ferocity of the conflict, the Second War for Armageddon did not end in a clear victory. The Orks, led by Ghazghkull, were forced to retreat from the planet after being unable to break the Imperial resistance completely. Ghazghkull, realising that Armageddon was a lost cause for the moment, withdrew his forces from the planet, but he did so with pride intact. His invasion had not succeeded in taking Armageddon, but the war had left an inedible mark on both the Orks and Imperium. For the Orks, Ghazghkull's victory was not just one of military conquest, but one of spiritual importance. His victory, as the prophet of Gork and Mork, solidified his place in Ork history. His Waaagh was not just a battle for land, but a battle to prove that gods favoured him, and that the Orks had the right to challenge the Imperium on a scale never seen before. The aftermath of the war saw Armageddon heavily scarred. Its industry and civilian population had been decimated. Ghazghkull's forces, though defeated, still controlled large portions of the planet's surface, while Imperial forces, though victorious, had suffered catastrophic losses. The war did not end in peace, but rather a fragile truce. For the Imperium, Ghazghkull's name had become synonymous with the Ork aggression, and his departure was only temporary. It was a reminder that the Orks, under a leader like Ghazghkull, could launch wars of unimaginable scale. The threat of Ghazghkull Thraka and his Waaagh was not over. He had left Armageddon, but only to prepare for his next campaign, one that would undoubtedly shake the very fabric of the Imperium itself. Thus, Ghazghkull Thraka's legacy was cemented as a master strategist, a religious figure among his people, and a devastating force against humanity. His vision of a galaxy-spanning Waaagh was one that would echo for centuries, as the Orks under his leadership continued to pose an existential threat to the Imperium. Ghazghkull was a force of destiny, a green tide that could never fully be defeated. The Orks were not a species known for their restraint. It was only a matter of time before Ghazghkull Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet of the Waaagh, returned to the scene of his most famous failure, the industrial world of Armageddon. The Second War for Armageddon, a brutal clash between the Orks and the Imperium, had ended in a brutal stalemate. Ghazghkull's Waaagh had surged across the world, leaving much of the planet in ruins, but in the end, he had been forced to retreat, unable to fully break the defences of the Imperium. The warlords who had rallied behind him might have lost a battle, but the true defeat was never felt by the Ork race as a whole. Ghazghkull's retreat was not a retreat at all. It was a call to regroup and replenish his forces, and to return stronger than before. And return he would, not just for another raid, but for total conquest. In the year 999 of the 41st millennium, nearly 6 decades after the Second War for Armageddon, Ghazghkull's forces surged across the galaxy, preparing for the Third War for Armageddon. This time, Ghazghkull had learned from his mistakes of the past. He had refined his strategies, harnessed new resources, and unified even more Ork clans under his banner. But more importantly, he was no longer the simple war boss of his early campaigns. Ghazghkull had become an icon, a living legend of Ork kind, the prophet of Gork and Mork. His presence alone was enough to galvanise the Ork race. His belief that Gork and Mork had chosen him to lead a galactic Waaagh resonated deeply with every Ork across the galaxy. And so, the Ork warlord, now more dangerous than ever, set his sights back on Armageddon, the symbol of his greatest failure. The Third War for Armageddon was unlike any Ork invasion before it. The sheer scale of the assault was staggering, and this time, Ghazghkull had more than just brute force at his disposal, he had strategy. The Ork war machines were more advanced, their tactics more calculated. This wasn't just an invasion, this was a campaign of annihilation. The Orks had learned the lessons of the previous attempts to conquer the world. This time, Ghazghkull did not waste resources on indiscriminate raids or chaotic battles. Instead, he launched a full-scale assault that would see Armageddon brought to its knees. Armageddon itself, despite its previous scars, was a critical Imperial stronghold, a world at the centre of the Imperium's war industry. It produced countless weapons and war machines vital to the Imperium's survival, and its loss would be catastrophic. It was a war the Imperium could not afford to lose, and so, when Ghazghkull's massive war fleet arrived in Armageddon's system, the Imperium had little choice but to respond with everything they could muster. At the heart of the Third War for Armageddon, the Imperial defence would have one of its greatest heroes, Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. Yarrick, now a living legend in the Imperium, had served with distinction during the Second War for Armageddon. His indomitable spirit and leadership had helped the humans hold their ground against the Ork tide. He was instrumental in rallying Imperial forces, organising counterattacks, and fighting alongside the defenders in the hellish urban battles across the planet. Yarrick's personal hatred for Ghazghkull was well known, and he would become a key figure in the third and most dangerous clash with the Ork warlord. As the Ork forces descended upon Armageddon, it was clear they had brought far more than before. Ghazghkull had not just amassed more Orks, he had brought in massive war machines, huge warlord-class titans, and even looted Imperial technology that he had modified and adapted to Ork specifications. The Orks now wielded advanced weaponry and devastating firepower. Alongside their usual horde of mob-fueled infantry, Ork gargants, towering walker titans, crashed through the ground like living fortresses, launching massive barrages of destructive firepower. Ork bombers filled the skies, dropping payloads of explosives on Imperial positions, while squiggoths, enormous living beasts, charged through the ruined streets, tearing apart anything in their path. The Ork strategy, honed through decades of conflict, was as simple as it was brutal: hit hard, hit fast, and overwhelm. There would be no subtlety, no tricks. Ghazghkull's forces simply had to smash through the Imperium's defences. They cut through outer defence lines with reckless abandon, tearing into Imperial Guard trenches and fortifications with little regard for casualties. Ork boys and knobs stormed the front lines, while Ork artillery pounded the city blocks into rubble. The Ork mentality was one of perpetual momentum. There was no such thing as too much force. Ghazghkull's presence was a catalyst for the Ork forces. His status as prophet of Gork and Mork had given him a mystique that the Orks had never seen in a leader before. He had become a living embodiment of the Waaagh itself, and his charisma, if an Ork could be said to have charisma, was undeniable. Wherever he went, Ork forces rallied behind him, driven by an almost religious fervour. As long as Ghazghkull shouted the war cry of the Waaagh, his armies followed him, mindlessly without hesitation. And the more battles they won, the more believers they gained. But Ghazghkull's strategic brilliance wasn't just about overwhelming force. He had learned from the Second War for Armageddon, and now employed tactics that kept the Imperium on the defensive at every turn. He split his forces, launching simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, never allowing the Imperium to concentrate their defences. His mechanised units struck hard in the city centres, while his mob of boys carried out lightning-fast raids, sowing chaos and confusion behind enemy lines. As the war escalated, the Imperial response became more desperate. Commissar Yarrick, who had seen the worst the Orks could offer, took command of the Imperial defences. He was determined not to let Armageddon fall, but the odds were increasingly stacked against him. The Orks had the numbers, the weapons and the momentum. Even with his legendary leadership and the reinforcements sent by the Imperium, it seemed that defences were buckling under the sheer weight of the Ork assault. And then came the turning point, Ghazghkull himself leading the charge through the heart of Hades' Hive, the largest and most fortified of Armageddon's Imperial cities. The Imperial Fists, the stalwart Space Marine chapter, engaged the Ork forces in one of the most fierce urban battles ever fought. Ghazghkull's personal force clashed against the Adeptus Astartes and the remaining Imperial Guard forces in a violent push to capture the Hive City's central complex. In a legendary battle that seemed to burn through the very heart of the city, Ghazghkull's massive form clashed against the Imperial defences. He was a whirlwind of violence, leading from the front, cutting down enemy soldiers and crushing those who dared to challenge him. Commissar Yarrick, though he fought fiercely to the last, knew that the situation was slipping out of the Imperium's grasp. His forces were being overwhelmed, and his own resolve was tested like never before. Yarrick would go on to fight Ghazghkull directly, his power claw facing off against the Ork warlord's massive, mechanical body in a fight that would see Yarrick emerge victorious, but gravely wounded. The battle, however, was far from over. In the end, the Imperium held the line, but at an immense cost. Armageddon was not fully lost, but it was a world shattered, devastated beyond measure. Ghazghkull, though he failed to claim the planet, had dealt a crippling blow to the Imperium's military might, and had proven once again that the Orks, under the right leadership, could unleash devastation on an unimaginable scale. His retreat from Armageddon was not the end of the Ork threat, but simply a pause before another Waaagh would be launched. The Third War for Armageddon would become a legend in its own right, one that would echo across Imperial history as a grim reminder of the Ork menace. Ghazghkull Thraka, the prophet of Gork and Mork, had proven that the Orks would never be fully defeated, and as long as he drew breath, the Orks would always have a leader capable of leading them in a war unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. While the Imperium of Man faced the chaos of the Orks, far across the galaxy in the Octarius sector, an unprecedented conflict was unfolding. This was not a war between human and Orks, nor was it one born of the usual territorial ambitions of the Greenskins. This time, the Orks would face an enemy even more relentless and ravenous than themselves, the Tyranids. What was meant to be a localised war quickly became a cataclysmic struggle that threatened to consume everything in its path. This was the Octarius War, an apocalyptic conflict that would see Orks and Tyranids clash in one of the bloodiest and most brutal wars the galaxy's seen. The Octarius sector was an industrial and strategic hub located in a remote corner of the Imperium. On the surface, it was a region of little importance to the greater galaxy, mostly ignored by the Central Powers. However, the sector was a prime hunting ground for the Ork warbands that roamed the galaxy. The Orks had long made their home here, building an empire through sheer force and violence, and despite their internal fragmentation and constant infighting, they had achieved something remarkable. For the first time in history, a powerful Ork empire had begun to form. This empire was ruled by a cunning and ruthless war boss known as Overfiend of Octarius, who had united many Ork clans and tribes under a single banner. However, in the year 999.M41, the Orks' dominance in the sector would be challenged by a new and terrifying force, the Tyranids. The Tyranids were a nightmarish race of insectoid, bioengineered creatures, capable of devouring entire planets and converting them into nothing more than barren husks. They had been drawn to the sector by huge biosignatures of the Orks themselves, who had been fighting and feeding off each other for millennia. The Tyranid hive fleets had arrived in search of new worlds to consume, and the Orks, ever eager to battle, would become the perfect adversaries. As the Tyranid hive fleet Leviathan descended upon the Octarius sector, the Orks, under the leadership of the Overfiend, were already entrenched in war. The Ork warlord, though a brutal and skilled tactician, had not anticipated the might of the Tyranids. Their swarm of bioforms, horrific creatures capable of overwhelming the strongest defences with sheer numbers, descended on the Ork territories in a terrifying wave of destruction. At first, the Orks were confident in their ability to fight back. Ork technology, though crude, was powered by the Waaagh energy, and their war machines had proven devastating in battle. The Ork boys, with their ever-present hunger for battle, were not easily intimidated by the alien menace. The Overfiend rallied his warbands, and the Ork forces began to surge forward, ready to wage war. The Ork war machines were put into motion. Gargants, battle wagons, and looted tanks rolled out to meet the Tyranids in the field. The Ork warbands clashed head-on with the alien invaders, believing that their overwhelming force and indomitable spirit would see them through. However, the Tyranids were far more than the Orks had bargained for. The Tyranid forces, like an unstoppable plague, were organised and ruthless. They advanced in vast swarms, consuming and overwhelming everything in their path. Hormagaunts, Gene Stealers and Termagaunts charged the Ork positions, their claws and fangs ripping into the Ork armour like paper. Carnifexes, monstrous biotitans, trampled over anything that stood in their way, while biovores rained down deadly spore mines that devastated Ork positions from a distance. The Orks, using psychic Waaagh energy, which could empower their crude technology and make their guns fire with unerring accuracy, was no match for the Tyranids' hive minds' unnatural coordination and biological weaponry. The Orks, who thrived on their chaotic fighting spirit and the explosive energy of their Waaagh, found themselves at a disadvantage. For the first time in a long while, they were up against an enemy that didn't just care about fighting, it cared about consuming. The Tyranids, with their endless, ravenous hordes, began to consume Ork territory at a terrifying pace. Where the Orks had fought with bloodthirsty abandon, the Tyranids struck with cold, efficient determination. Yet the Orks, for all their faults, had one thing that the Tyranids did not: the love of battle itself. As the Tyranid advance raged on, the Orks' innate desire for destruction began to turn the tide. The Weird Boys, the Ork Psychers, began to gather the energy of the Waaagh once more, amplifying the Ork force's power. The Waaagh surged through Ork weaponry, amplifying their effectiveness, while Ork leaders rallied their forces for a final, desperate push. But Ghazghkull Thraka, the legendary Ork war boss, saw an opportunity. Sensing the power of the Tyranid threat and seeing the chaos in the Ork ranks, he seized upon the situation. Ghazghkull was no ordinary Ork leader. He was a genius strategist, capable of uniting the most fractious Ork clans into a single force. He believed the Waaagh was more than just battle.
It was a force that transcended individual orcs and carried them into victory. Ghazghkull's belief that the orc gods Gork and Mork had chosen him as their prophet drove him to unite the orc forces against their common enemy. Ghazghkull's intervention in the Octarius War was a turning point. His brutal, charismatic leadership began to unify the scattered orc warbands, creating a force that could stand against the Tyranid swarm. Ghazghkull's strategies were simple but effective: overwhelm the enemy with numbers, strike where they least expect it, and fight until there's nothing left to fight for. He pushed the orcs to fight with a single purpose, using the Tyranid forces as fuel for the Waaagh, turning their presence into a rallying point for the orc race. Despite the orcs' united front, the Tyranids continued to pour into the sector in wave after wave. However, the orcs, now led by the indomitable Ghazghkull, struck back with ferocity that had never been known before. The orcs turned the sector into a battlefield, tearing apart Tyranid forces wherever they encountered them. The war became a massive meat grinder, with both sides suffering devastating losses. The battle for Octarius Prime, the sector's central world, was a climax for the war. Orc forces led by Ghazghkull fought tooth and nail against the Tyranid High Fleet, in what would be remembered as a battle of attrition. The orcs were on the back foot, fighting a war for survival, but the Tyranids could not maintain their momentum. Ghazghkull's leadership, combined with the orcs' relentless fighting spirit, proved to be a deadly combination. The Tyranids were forced to retreat, and for the moment, the Orc Empire of Octarius was secured. However, the victory is not without its costs. The war had devastated the sector, leaving entire worlds scorched and broken. The Tyranid High Fleet, though repelled, had still succeeded in consuming large portions of the sector, and the Orcs, while victorious, had taken heavy casualties. The Octarius War, as it would later be known, became one of the most significant battles in Orc history, a reminder of the Orcs' unrelenting will to fight, even when faced with the most overwhelming enemies. Ghazghkull's victory in the Octarius War solidified his reputation as one of the greatest Orc leaders in history. His Waaagh had triumphed over the Tyranids, and he had proven that the Orc race, united under his banner, was more than capable of overcoming any threat. But the Tyranids were not gone, they would return, and Ghazghkull, the prophet of the Waaagh, would continue to lead his Orcs to ever greater battles, always seeking new wars, new conquests, and new ways to bring about the eternal conflict that was at the heart of Orc existence. For the Orcs, the victory in the Octarius War was just another step in the endless cycle of destruction. For the Imperium, it was a reminder that the Orcs would never fully be defeated. No matter how many battles they fought, the Orcs would always return. The galaxy, it seemed, would forever be the playground of the greenskin menace. The Orcs had always been a chaotic, fractious race. From the early days of the Krork in the War in Heaven to their unending battles against the Imperium of Man, the Greenskins had always been a force of nature, a chaotic swarm, united only by their love of battle. But as the 42nd millennium began, something unprecedented happened. Ghazghkull Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet, had set into motion an event that would bring about the most terrifying and overwhelming war the galaxy had ever seen. The Great Waaagh was not just another Orc war campaign, it was something more profound, more apocalyptic. It was the culmination of Orc aggression, a cataclysmic event that would see the Orcs push to conquer the entire galaxy, propelled by the combined psychic might of the Waaagh energy and the sheer relentless force of Ghazghkull's leadership. Under Ghazghkull's banner, the Orc race had been united like never before, and this would be their greatest war, unleashing the Green Tide, a tide that threatened to flood across the Imperium and beyond, sweeping all before it. It began when Ghazghkull, who had long been regarded as a figure of near mythical status, began to gather his warbands for a final galaxy-spanning Waaagh. Ghazghkull's reputation as the prophet of the Orc gods Gork and Mork had only grown over the centuries. His visions of grandeur of a Waaagh, unlike any other, were shared and amplified by the Orcs who rallied to him. The collective belief in Ghazghkull's divine purpose became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Orc warbands from across the galaxy flocked to him, not just out of desire to fight, but because they believed, in the deepest part of their fungal hearts, that this Waaagh was destined to succeed. This was the Great Waaagh, a tidal wave of Orc aggression that would unite all of Orcdom under the banner of a single, unassailable force. And when Ghazghkull gave the signal, the Waaagh would surge forth, consuming the galaxy in a cascade of destruction, leaving only wreckage and chaos in its wake. What began as a simple gathering of warbands soon turned into something far greater, an unstoppable force of annihilation, driven by a single goal, the conquest of everything in sight. The Orcs, though always violent and aggressive, were not usually so coordinated. The typical Orc warband was a collection of squabbling leaders, with rival factions and internal conflict always bubbling beneath the surface. But under Ghazghkull's rule, a new level of unity was forged. Ghazghkull was not only an inspiring leader, he was a master manipulator of the Waaagh energy, tapping into the psychic storms that swirled around the Orc race. His ability to harness the Waaagh allowed him to command his forces with an iron fist, guiding them as a single, cohesive army rather than a rabble of uncontrolled marauders. As the Orcs gathered, warbands from every corner of the galaxy poured in, bringing their engines of war, their savage beasts, and their irrepressible thirst for battle. The green tide spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the galaxy. In the wake of their gathering, the Orcs brought destruction to countless worlds. Systems were overrun, planets were scorched, and fleets of Orc ships and kill crushers tore through space, laying waste to everything in their path. The Imperium, already reeling from internal strife and external threats, now faced an enemy more dangerous than ever, the full might of the Orc race, united under a single banner. The green tide was relentless. Entire Imperial worlds were swept away by the Orc onslaught, with planetary defences faltering under the weight of the Waaagh energy. Even the finest soldiers of the Adeptus Astartes found themselves outnumbered and overwhelmed. Though the Space Marines fought valiantly, it was clear the Orcs were everywhere, pushing into sector after sector with an unyielding ferocity. But the Great Waaagh wasn't just about brute force, it was about psychic power too. The Waaagh energy, an almost mystical force that flowed through the Orc race, was the engine that powered Ghazghkull's unstoppable horde. The Orc war machines, looted from the other races or built from the wreckage of countless battles, hummed with the Waaagh energy, allowing them to work far better than their crew designs would suggest. Tanks that should have fallen apart on the battlefield rumbled on, firing devastating blasts of energy. Their ramshackle weapons defied the laws of physics, firing explosives, plasma and kinetic energy in ways that shouldn't have been possible, but the Orcs believed it worked, and so it did. Even Orc psychopower, previously unpredictable and often a source of danger to the greenskins themselves, now surged under the combined energy of the Waaagh. Weird Boys, the Orc equivalent of psychers, became powerful conduits for this psychic storm, unleashing devastating energy blasts that wreaked havoc on Imperial forces. When the Weird Boys unleashed their power, the effects were catastrophic. Storms of green lightning, waves of psychic force, and explosions of raw energy that disintegrated enemies before they even knew what hit them. As the Waaagh surged across the galaxy, Ghazghkull's influence became stronger. He was no longer just a warlord, he was a messianic figure among the Orcs. The Great Waaagh was his vision, and every Orc that fought under his banner believed in that vision with unshakable faith. His voice, amplified by the power of the Waaagh, carried to every Orc listening across the stars. His words, imbued with the psychic power of Gork and Mork, were an unmistakable call to war, one that resonated in the very marrow of every Orc in existence. But the Great Waaagh was not without its challenges. As the Orcs tore through the galaxy, they faced stiff resistance from the Imperium, and even from other alien races who had the misfortune to cross their path. The Eldar, who had long been a thorn in the side of the Orcs, launched retaliatory strikes, attempting to stall the Orc advance. The Tau Empire, eager to expand their influence, took advantage of the chaos, attempting to protect their borders from the greenskin threat. But for every race that fought to stop the Orcs, the Waaagh only grew stronger, propelled by the sheer momentum of the greenskins' unrelenting war. The Imperium especially found itself stretched thin. The Imperium's fleets, already battered from the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade and the ongoing battle against the forces of chaos, found themselves unprepared for the green tide that crashed upon them. Entire Imperial sectors fell to the Orcs, and the Imperium's once proud navy was forced to retreat from key positions. Despite the chaos and destruction, the Orcs thrived. Every battle, every fight, every victory fed their Waaagh, making them stronger and more numerous with each passing day. Their technology improved, albeit in an unprecedented manner. What should have been a simple raid often turned into a full-scale war that would see Orc war machines more advanced than before. Orc guns would blast through the hulls of Imperial warships, while their gargants stormed across battlefields, crushing all in their path. The Orc warbands began to truly unify, their forces working in unison under Ghazghkull's command, becoming more than a series of independent attacks, but an all-consuming juggernaut. As Ghazghkull's Waaagh spread across the galaxy, it became a galactic force of nature, unstoppable and fierce. Ghazghkull Thraka had united the Orcs like never before, turning them into a true threat to the very survival of the galaxy. No longer were the Orcs a fragmented, chaotic force. Under Ghazghkull's leadership, they were a singular, unstoppable tide, sweeping across planets, systems, and entire sectors with a singular purpose: to conquer and destroy. And so, the Great War raged on. The Imperium, with all its might, struggled to hold back the flood. The green tide seemed endless. No matter how many Orc warbands were destroyed, another would spring up in its place. Ghazghkull's vision had been realised, and now the Orcs were at war. Not for territory, not for treasure, but for something much greater. They fought because it was their destiny. The Great Waaagh had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. The galaxy would never be the same again.
Thank you for listening. If it intrigued, enraged, or enlightened you, subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, or share it with your battle brothers. New broadcasts incoming. But until then, may the Emperor protect. Or at least, may the warp ignore you.